So clearly the global South debt crisis is a massive systemic problem, and addressing it is going to take massive systemic change. But we are here to talk today about one issue that's actively making matters worse that we have an opportunity to address today. And those are called IMF surcharges. So what are surcharges? As you probably know, the IMF is considered the global lender of last resort. When developing countries are facing an acute crisis, they can turn to the IMF for loans to help them weather the storm. Now, naturally, these loans are not free. You have to be repaid with interest and with additional service fees. This is all very normal. But since the late 90s, the IMF has also imposed these lesser-known fees called surcharges, and these only apply to countries that are heavily indebted to the IMF. So specifically, countries have to pay a 2% level-based surcharge if their debt to the IMF exceeds a certain threshold, and they have to pay an additional 1% time-based surcharge if their debt to the IMF exceeds that threshold for a certain period of time. So I want to be clear that these are not punishments for non-payment. You could be making all of your payments perfectly on time and still accumulate enough debt that you have to pay these punitive surcharges. I think it's pretty clear on the face of it why this is a problem. So you're taking the very countries that are already struggling under onerous debt burdens, that in fact need relief from their debts, and you are punishing them with additional debt. Or as Representative Chuy Garcia said about surcharges, to me, this looks like the business model of payday lenders here in Chicago, not an economic development agency.
Okay, let's talk about surcharges. Surcharges are like those fine print junk fees that you find in your credit card, but in this case, for entire nations. When countries ask for a loan from the IMF that is a little bit larger than usual, they have to pay a higher interest rate. This is not the publicized headline rate, but a hidden fee that is charged in addition to the regular interest rates. This isn't even a penalty fee. It's for regularly paying back your loan, but still you have to pay these surcharges. So it's very similar to those small print in the credit cards that we find, in our common day-to-day lives. Another issue that perhaps you haven't heard about is the fact that recently, the US Congress passed a fairly sizable package of financing for Ukraine. But what you probably don't know is that a large chunk of that funding goes back to the IMF because they have to pay surcharges. They have to pay these extra fees to the International Monetary Fund that has been giving loans to Ukraine, and now Ukraine has to pay back, but with these extra higher interest rates. Another issue that's perhaps important for you to know is that surcharges are contributing to unstable Ponzi financing of the most indebted countries in the world to the IMF, which is supposed to be a bailout fund, a fund to help countries recover economically, to help them get out of a financial or balance of payments crisis. They're supposed to receive this foreign exchange so they can buy necessary imports to promote the state of the economy. But by charging them these extra fees, what you're actually doing is contributing to the crisis in the sense that it will get worse because more foreign exchange leaves the country as they have to pay that to the IMF. And at a second layer, more resources that could be used to finance the recovery of the economy, spending in health and education, in public investment and infrastructure, is instead used to pay the IMF for these surcharges. This has historical precedents. In the 90s, there used to be surcharges, but they were penalty fees for countries that hadn't been able to pay on time. And the IMF itself concluded that it was unreasonable to charge these extra fees. It so happens that maybe they forgot, and now in the 2000s, in the 21st century, they are now again charging these extra fees, and countries are, of course, having a very difficult time and prosperity in those countries is being threatened because the recovery is made much more difficult because they have to pay these extra fees. For example, the most recent IMF loans, including to my own country, Ecuador, implies that with surcharges, now Ecuador has to pay the IMF an interest rate of 8% per year. This is higher than the interest rate that Ecuador pays for loans to China. Remember that they say supposedly China charges high interest rates for their loans. Well, their loans are on average around 5% per year. But in this case, the IMF is now charging over 8% per year, right? So we have to fix this situation because the IMF can't be charging a higher rate than what others can get with bilateral loans, with bilateral relations. Now, the IMF has many excuses for charging these high interest rates with these hidden fees known as surcharges. But in reality, it's about profits. It's about having a surplus with the IMF accounts at the end of every year. And they say, look, we need to have enough of a buffer with this extra income so that they can have what are called precautionary balances, which is just a euphemism for having excess capital. Recall that the IMF is not a corporation. It cannot go broke. In fact, it depends on quotas that each of the countries in the world pays into the IMF. So there is no lack of funding. There's no lack of money in the case of the IMF. They have over $1 trillion in firepower, and they have much more still available in their current finances. So they don't need this extra income. However, they justify this because, of course, they want to show that they have supposedly good results at the end of every year. But it does not make sense that the extra income or the profits or the surplus of the IMF depends on the most vulnerable, the most indebted countries that are in a weak financial situation and that are supposed to actually get support from the rest of the international community. But even now, given all this, the IMF has recently reached the threshold for what it calls strong finances, with a floor, with a threshold of what they needed in terms of what they call the precautionary balances. So these buffers have reached over 25 billion SDRs, which is over $30 billion. So they already have enough. They've already reached their target. So why keep charging surcharges to countries that are in a vulnerable situation? There are no more excuses, and it's the time to eliminate surcharges altogether. The IMF, unfortunately, is not taking a direct move to get rid of these surcharges. They now want to shift the goalpost, move the goalpost again. And they're saying, oh, no, fine, sure, we've reached the precautionary balances target, but now let's use surcharges for other purposes. No, that's not fair. That is not legal certainty for the international community. They're moving the goalposts, and now they're saying, oh, now we could use perhaps this extra income for some other thing. No, that is not correct. That is being unfair to the countries that have had to make sacrifices to play with the rules of the game that were there before. And now they want to come up with new rules for using surcharges instead of getting rid of them after the threshold has been reached. That is not fair at all. And we need to pass legislation, in this case in the United States Congress, that gives a mandate to the Treasury, which is the entity that represents the US government at the IMF. Why is this very important? Because the United States has veto power within the IMF. It is the most powerful country in the IMF. And if the United States has a mandate to get rid of surcharges, it can join forces with the poorest countries in the globe, from Africa, from Latin America, from South Asia, that are paying these hefty fees, and can get rid of them once and for all. This is the key to the issue of surcharges, and I hope we can count on all of you to get this legislation passed and support a huge relief in terms of debt servicing to one of the multilateral institutions, which in this case is the IMF, and show the way of how other debt relief initiatives can actually happen in other arenas. Thank you.